There is no conscience, no compassion, no humanity, no sense of ethics in this.
It was a laboratory conceived in hell, a place where death was routinely met.
The Japanese soldier jammed bayonets like this into the stomachs of 6 people, and their intestines spilled out.
Those who entered never left.
I was told they were killed in a gas chamber. I could see the smoke rise.
To this day, the experiments remain unclear.
I think they gave me Amtrak. I think they gave me scarlet fever.
I know they took probably at least 1 or 2 of our guys up there, because we never heard about them again.
And when the evil finally ended, it was compounded.
The U.S. government not only knew about these atrocities, but covered up these medical atrocities in exchange for the medical data.
Today, the crimes remain unpunished.
Everybody got away with what they had done. We must have justice for the victims.
It was called Unit 731, and this is its secret story. Harbin, Manchuria, once known as the Paris of the Far East, as its close proximity to what was once Russia gave the city a unique European flavor. Today, Harbin is primarily a manufacturing center, and its 3 million inhabitants work hard to put specific horrors of the past behind them. And those horrors have a name: Unit 731. 1930, the seeds of the Pacific were sown with the brutal Japanese military occupation of China. The Japanese population had outgrown its natural resources, so the Empire of the Sun saw the bounty of China and decided to take what it needed. Their invasion left death and destruction in its wake. Cities, towns, and hamlets were leveled, looted, and burned. Rivers of terrified refugees fled the savagery. Despite their arrogance, Japan's military leaders knew that they were not invincible. Other countries, including the nearby and hostile Soviet Union, were rumored to have something Japan did not: biochemical weapons. In order to continue their consolidation of Asia without fear of reprisal, Japan knew that they must develop a biological and chemical arsenal, far from the prying eyes of the world. And while no one was watching, anything could and did happen.
Thousands of Japanese scientists, technicians, medical doctors, veterinarians, dentists, all sorts of professionally trained scientific personnel engaged in the most atrocious actions that one can imagine. They vivisected people, they cut them open while they were alive, sometimes even without the use of an anesthetic, showed the various parts of the human body as it was functioning.
Modern biochemical warfare began in 1915 during the First World War. The Germans attempted to break the bloody stalemate of trench warfare by the deliberate deployment of chlorine gas. The weapon proved extremely effective, but imprecise. A shift in wind direction could kill the attacker as easily as the attacked. But soon, both sides were using chlorine gas routinely.
World War I started this notion of total warfare, of slaughter on a scale which the world had never sort of experienced before. To win a war, people thought you had to be willing to employ any weapon. Notions of morality in warfare were very fluid indeed.
Shocked by the human cost of these weapons, 10 years after the first use of gas, the Geneva Protocol, a treaty ratified by 145 countries, including Japan, banned biological weapons. But words on paper were not enough to stop an opportunistic Japanese army officer from conceiving the plans that would result in the creation of Unit 731. An officer some call a monster, others a genius. His name, Shiro Ishii.
To characterize him as a monster would be appropriate, because the man has no sense of humanity whatsoever. He loved his children. He was a good father. He was a good husband by the culture standards of the time. But one can say that Adolf Hitler liked children too.
Shiro Ishii was born in 1892 into a wealthy Japanese family. His family owned more land than any other in their community, and with that power came privilege. The Ishii's almost feudal dominance extended to nearby villages. Because of his family's wealth and position, Shiro Ishii grew up to be arrogant. He had little or no regard for those he saw as being beneath him.
He had no sense of morality. He was loyal to the emperor and to the military, and yet embezzled funds from the appropriations he received. He's very difficult to really kind of pinpoint, except for his almost monomaniacal ambition to develop biological weapons. That's the only thing that's consistent about this man. It's his single-minded purpose in life was to become known as the father of biological weapons.
Lieutenant Ishii had a gift for manipulating the bureaucracy of the Japanese army. He soon began to recruit the allies who would help him to realize his goal, a state-of-the-art medical research facility in occupied Manchuria, a laboratory over which he had complete authority. Ishii kept his ultimate plan secret from all but his closest associates. But this network of friends led all the way up to the man whom the Japanese considered a living god, Emperor Hirohito himself.
There could be no deployment of military units overseas or biochemical operations without orders from the emperor.
Emperor Hirohito's brothers, other relatives, most important was his uncle, actually participated. They visited some of these death camps, or what I term death factories.
In 1936, by explicit imperial order, Ishii's dream was approved by Emperor Hirohito. Ishii immediately left for Harbin to supervise every phase of creation of the world's greatest medical research facility dedicated to biological warfare. Ironically, it was officially referred to as an epidemic prevention and water supply unit. And as Shiro Ishii assembled his scientific team in Harbin, he revealed the real reason for locating Unit 731 in China. The Japanese occupation of China was no less brutal than their invasion. Secret police roamed the countryside, rounding up anyone suspected of opposition. Chinese and Russians who lived in Manchuria were fair game. Shiro Ishii saw an inexhaustible supply of research materials, human research materials.
They just killed people for no apparent reason except to determine how they would react when being killed.
In order to keep Japan's need for chemical and biological weapons secret from the world, their secret laboratory, Unit 731, was deliberately located in a remote part of their newly conquered empire. Shiro Ishii, the mastermind behind the operation, knew he needed complete impunity, isolation, and a constant supply of test subjects in order to successfully carry out his research. He chose to build in Pingfan, a suburb of Harbin. With a population of 240,000 Chinese and 81,000 Russians and other non-Chinese, Harbin was remote yet accessible, and its prisons were well stocked with laboratory fodder. Construction of Unit 731 began almost immediately, and Shiro Ishii oversaw every detail. Nothing was left to chance. An unlimited supply of funds was provided by the Japanese government for state-of-the-art equipment and anything and everything Ishii required for himself and his staff.
There was a huge building that was called the Administrative Building. It was so big and so well constructed that at the end of the war, when all of Ping Fan was destroyed, they couldn't blow up the building.
Tucked away in the interior of the administration building was a prison where up to 500 men, women and children at a time could be housed. This was the most secret part of this already top-secret facility. Unit 731 was staffed with the cream of the crop of Japanese scientists and research medics. The scientists turned the compound into a nightmare laboratory, using humans as test animals. Not only could all types of debilitating biological weapons be developed to use against Japan's enemies, advanced research into how to treat Japanese soldiers with such weapons, as well as conventional arms attacks, could be done. This process of dehumanization began with a twist of the language, based on the lie told to mislead the local population into a false sense of security. This cover story stated that Unit 731 was a harmless lumber mill.
These scientists had a weird sense of humor. They referred to their victims as marutas, which is loosely translated as logs. And that's how they thought of them, as pieces of wood, not as humans. You can carve them up, you can burn them in a fireplace. Who cares?
There was no shortage of this living wood for the construction of Shiro Ishii's dreams.
If they ran short of candidates, the secret police would just literally sweep the streets of the city and pick up enough candidates for the lab.
Who would then be placed on a one-way train ride to Unit 731.
The train with 8 boxcars stopped. Soldiers opened the doors and removed what looked like straw mats wrapped in steel wires. I didn't know what was happening. And then I noticed arms sticking out and heads moving and blood coming out. And then the Japanese soldiers yelled logs, so I knew those were people.
The fate of these prisoners was ordained the moment they entered the compound. Not one survived.
We were testing the effectiveness of germs to determine how many people would be killed without giving a vaccine. In other prisoners, we injected vaccines and waited a while for antibodies to react. As we expected, those who did not get the vaccine got sick and died first. So we dissected them.
The best way, in the minds of the scientists, to observe the human body's defense system battling the invading pathogen was by performing live vivisection, rarely giving anesthesia.
I was ordered to wash that person's body with a deck brush before he or she was taken into the dissection room naked by a member of a special team. The first time, I trembled. One team member was listening to the heartbeat using a stethoscope. One was standing holding a knife. The moment a stethoscope was removed from his ear, a knife went into the body. I did not know, but according to doctors, this timing was very important, because if the timing was wrong, we could get blood all over us, and then we could get infected.
Not only were the prisoners deliberately infected with deadly diseases and dissected alive, they were also used for many more dramatic tests. 50 different lethal experiments, many thought up spontaneously and capriciously by Ishii and his staff.
This place was Unit 731's frostbite experiment lab, built in 1943. All year round, frostbite lab tests were conducted inside. What we still have today here is the base of their freezing machine, observation windows, etc.
They had refrigerated chambers, and also in Manchuria, the winters are very severe, 40, 50 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit, and they would expose prisoners, various parts of their bodies, to these temperatures, freeze them, and then try various techniques to literally dehydrate them to see what was the most effective way of dealing with frostbite, so that that could be used in warfare as well, both to protect Japanese troops as well as to affect the enemy.
Some experiments were markedly more violent than others. To determine the best course of treatment of varying degrees of shrapnel wounds sustained in the field by Japanese soldiers, Chinese prisoners were exposed to direct bomb blasts. They were strapped, unprotected, to wooden planks staked in the ground at increasing distances around a bomb which was then detonated. Afterward, it was surgery for most, post-mortems for the rest.
People who were experimented on generally lasted 4 to 6 weeks, and then they were sacrificed. What is so heinous about this is that anyone was prey to these experiments. We're talking about men, women, children.
Bodies were disposed of in a crematorium, much like the ones that were working overtime 3,000 miles away in Nazi-occupied Europe.
There were always 2,000 or 3,000 logs prepared. There were 2 burning places, and they were always burning dead bodies. I imagine they died because of the research.
Like their counterparts in the Nazi death camps, the dedicated Japanese who toiled away at Unit 731 saw their work as noble.
They were serving the emperor, they were serving their country. That's all they were interested in. The fact that people were being killed in these experiments meant nothing to them.
And Shiro Ishii had plans that spread far beyond the walls of his compound. He planned to create weapons that could reach as far as America, and he began to use the surrounding countryside as a laboratory.
They not only worked on humans in laboratories, but when they developed what they believed were prototypes for weapons of the future, they field tested them on cities and villages throughout China. Hundreds of thousands of people were affected by these field tests. Many tens of thousands were killed in these field tests. Many other uncountable numbers became ill.
Unit 731 worked overtime throughout the Second World War to provide horrific biological and chemical weapons for the Japanese Empire. Ishii and his scientific team soon determined that the thousands of rats kept at the facility could be used as living flea factories. All that was needed were field experiments to determine the best way to spread disease, and to help Ishii accomplish his first and foremost goal, the creation of deadly and easily deliverable bubonic plague bacteria. Bubonic plague causes a high fever, vomiting of blood, shivering, body pains, and respiratory failure that results in a dark purple body color. 3 out of 4 people who contract this disease die. Even those odds of survival were too high for Shiro Ishii. In order to perfect the perfect plague, Ishii decided to turn his attention to the surrounding countryside. But Ishii had one large problem. Although he had the perfect bacteria and the perfect carrier, he had to find a perfect delivery system. First, he tried spraying fleas from aeroplanes. Shoichi Matsumoto was a pilot attached to the unit.
Under the wings, there was a space to attach bombs. Instead of bombs, a basket or something like that was attached. It was almost 1 meter long and opened on each side and was filled with deadly fleas.
Tests began immediately, and the targets were Chinese villages unlucky enough to be within range. There was no other reason for their selection and no mercy for their inhabitants. In early 1939, mysterious killer plagues began to break out in villages and continued to do so until 1942.
My village is in the southern part of the county, and plague suddenly broke out in late summer 1942. Suddenly broke out, and 1/3 of the villagers died. 8 people in my grandfather's family died of plague.
Other delivery systems were tried, including poisoning the precious local water supplies on which the Chinese depended. No matter how these plagues were introduced, the results were devastating to those unlucky enough to be contaminated.
Between 1941 and early November and 1942, there was an outbreak of the plague. The first person infected with the plague was a neighbor, and then it was the families around. Within 10 days, 13 villagers died of the plague.
In 1942, my grandfather, within a short time, could not get up from his bed and died. After him, it was my grandmother, who also was sick and died within a day or two.
The symptoms and toxicity were precisely what Ishii was looking for.
People died. Nobody dared to bury them or carry them. They had to be cremated.
My sister's gland was swelling up on her neck. Her neck was so swollen that it was as thick as her head. So, without any of her loved ones by her side, she went into the field and died by herself.
Not content spreading plague, Ishii's men even sunk so low as to hand out sweets to starving Chinese children. Sweets that were laced with anthrax, a highly lethal disease that attacks the respiratory and digestive system. Conducting these indiscriminate tests was dangerous work, and on occasion the Japanese themselves became victims. Over the years, 1,600 Japanese researchers and soldiers died as a result of mishandling the various bacteria and viruses. Ishii knew that these delivery systems were too imprecise. Then he had a flash of inspiration. He decided to deliver unconventional payloads with modified conventional weapons, ceramic bombs loaded with plague-infested fleas. The bombs could be aimed, and not only would the fleas survive the drop, all traces of the ceramic shell would disintegrate into the soil. Target villages were selected, the infectious bombings were carried out. But in their relentless quest for perfection, the Japanese decided they needed to examine their victims on the front lines.
The Japanese came to the village in white uniforms, with high boots, rubber boots, and with masks.
As in the labs at Unit 731, immediate examination of the damage being done by the pathogens was of the greatest value.
They just divided the peasants into 2 groups. They pulled them into the fields and opened their belly when they were still alive.
These open-air dissections and other equally grim tests were conducted for a reason: to perfect a weapon that could be deployed against Japan's enemies. And the #1 enemy was the United States. Thanks to Shiro Ishii, Japan now had a way to strike back. The Second World War in the Pacific was as ugly and racist a war as has ever been fought. And to the Japanese, the United States was the main enemy. After Pearl Harbor, they looked for ways to strike back and attack the US mainland. And in order to achieve this goal, they were prepared to stop at nothing. Even, some believe, experimentation on Allied prisoners of war. Among the first prisoners taken by Japan in the early years of the war were the self-proclaimed battling bastards of Bataan. These men, taken prisoner in the Philippines in the spring of 1942, not only survived the infamous Death March, but they also survived transshipment from the Philippines to Japan and China, just ahead of MacArthur's dramatic return. Some of these men, at this point reduced to skin and bones by years of malnutrition, ended up in a POW camp in the city of Mudken, 500 miles south of Harbin. It was there at the end of 1944 that the normal program of brutality took a strange turn. The POWs began to receive visits from Japanese doctors. Surprising, because this was the first medical attention of any sort that they had received in over 3 years of captivity.
Well, the interesting thing is that none of the guys knew anything about 731. All we knew is that we were getting all kinds of shots and things like that, but they were telling us at the time that this is just for your health. They didn't have any idea that it was experimentation.
I think they gave me Amtrak. I think they gave me scarlet fever.
Some believe that their fellow prisoners were actually taken directly to Unit 731 for more personal and fatal attention.
I know they took probably at least 1 or 2 of our guys up there, because we never heard about them again.
When Mudken was finally liberated in September of 1945, the newly released prisoners were debriefed, but the records of their testimonies were officially sealed. More than 50 years later, their stories have still not been verified by the US government. And toward the end of the war, the terrible weapons created by Unit 731 came very close to being used on the United States mainland.
They hoped to fill balloons with germs and float them across the Pacific Ocean to attack West Coast cities. First, to try them, they launched them with explosives. And if that had succeeded, they would then launch them with germs.
Of the several thousand balloon bombs launched at America, only 200 actually made it, one traveling as far east as Michigan. Each balloon was designed to carry incendiary devices. While some exploded, causing fires and limited damage, lives were lost in only one case. It touched down on the 5th of May 1945 at the site of a church outing near Bly, Oregon. The resulting explosion killed 5 children and a minister's young wife who was 8 months pregnant. Fortunately for Americans, the war ended before any of Ishii's balloon bombs loaded with germs could be released.
No question in my mind that had the Japanese had the facilities, they would have attacked American cities on the West Coast and as far inland as possible. In war, anything goes. That was the Japanese attitude.
With the Japanese surrender on the 2nd of September 1945, Shiro Ishii's primary goal turned to survival, and his genius served him well.
When the war was ending, Unit 731 got an order from the emperor that they must destroy all the evidence. At that time, 400 Chinese were still alive for human experimentation, were still alive, and they killed all of them.
But the deadly legacy of Unit 731 survived. The Pandora's box of plague that had been opened would continue to spread disease well after the end of the war and occupation. In 1947 alone, an outbreak of the plague killed 30,000 people in Harbin. And there was another, and in a way even more deadly legacy of Unit 731. It began the day America occupied Japan.
The United States had a pretty good picture of what was going on by the time of the Japanese surrender. They sent over scientific investigators. The American scientists convinced American intelligence, which was not too difficult to do, that the information they sought was in the best interests of the United States.
And Shiro Ishii was the man who had possession of that information. The end of the Second World War marked the beginning of a different kind of war, a Cold War, that would see the United States pitted against the Soviet Union in a game of military one-upmanship. Any perceived advantage was to be exploited, regardless of the moral consequences. And within weeks of the war ending, the volumes of terrible research from Unit 731 began to attract American attention.
One of the biggest reasons that the details of Japan's bacteriological warfare were not revealed for a long time after the war was because the American government permitted the negotiation and dealing of the matter and did not release the findings to the public.
The Japanese not only kept meticulous records of their nightmarish experiments, but had the foresight to realize that these records might be their ticket to survival after the war. Shiro Ishii himself returned to Japan from China and began to play a game of high-risk poker with the Americans. If they agreed not to prosecute him and his associates for war crimes, he would hand over and decipher his research. It was a hellish proposition, with a sadly predictable outcome.
One of the most interesting documents that I've come across was a memo written in 1946 by the director of the Chemical Warfare Service of the United States, which said the idea of prosecuting Japanese for chemical warfare, as this would cramp the United States' ability in the future to engage in chemical warfare itself.
American scientists were fascinated with the opportunity to acquire human experimental data. By law and by ethical tradition, American scientists could only work on animals in laboratories. But here was an opportunity, a golden opportunity, to acquire human experimental data. And they bought the idea. And so word was out that the American scientists wanted to meet their Japanese colleagues. They were not former enemies. They were not war criminals. They were scientific colleagues.
With the Cold War on the horizon, the Americans became more desperate for a solid advantage over the Soviets, making the Japanese hand stronger.
It took several years because the Japanese scientists very cleverly played on this almost maniacal passion by American scientists to get human data by saying, we have so much you wouldn't believe, but we're not going to turn over a single item to you until we get in writing a grant of immunity from any prosecution for war crimes.
For Ishii and his partners in war crimes, the US military's frenzied need for advantage paid off.
In the spring of 1948, the deal was completed. The Japanese scientists turned over some, not all their data to the American scientists, and they were granted immunity from prosecution.
By some kind of cold-blooded calculus, the United States felt it had the best deal.
One of the chief scientists in the negotiations wrote to his superior, the general in charge of the Chemical Corps, that we got all of this information for a cost of about $250,000. We got a bargain, in effect, he said. We got a bargain for this deal with the devil.
Shiro Ishii, the devil of Unit 731, the man who personally created the living hell of Unit 731. died in 1959 at age 67 of natural causes, still a hero in his hometown. He never served a day in prison.
He will be remembered as one of the most venal and evil figures of the 20th century. He ranks up there with the heads of European concentration camps. The infamous Dr. Joseph Mengele could take lessons from Ishi in evil.
I think one of the consequences of Unit 731 and the cover-up of Unit 731 is the corruption of the scientific community of Japan after the war. So many scientists, doctors, who were co-opted or volunteered to help with this gigantic experiment, after the war attained such senior positions in academia, in government.
But today, the whitewash has begun to wear off.
The entire world is gradually going to learn the truth of Unit 731 and the Pacific Holocaust of World War II. History has a tendency of repeating itself, and if we don't educate the next generation of children about what happened, there's no guarantee that something like this isn't going to happen again.
San Francisco, the summer of 1998. At an exhibit memorializing the victims of Unit 731, those who can never forget came face to face with those who never knew.
There was a larger pattern here of extermination, of genocide, of massacre, which I think many Americans are just only barely starting to learn about.
Conferences, traveling exhibits and books have begun to spread the story of Unit 731 savagery worldwide. The dissemination of the truth is part of a larger movement to force Japan to come to grips with its past, a past that many Japanese continue to deny.
It is understandably that a proud nation is reluctant to acknowledge its past misdeeds. But a great nation must overcome its pride and face the painful truth.
If one reads Japanese textbooks, there's scarcely a mention of anything negative about the Japanese role in World War II. Most Japanese are taught that Japan was not an aggressor nation, but instead, because of the dropping of the atomic bomb, Japan was a victim of World War II. And that mindset persists to this very day in very large numbers of Japanese citizens.
The Chinese government, which has never reconciled with Japan, is doing everything it can to keep memories of Unit 731 alive. Today, in Harbin, a portion of what is left of the compound has been turned into a museum, a tourist site. The ghosts of the past will not be allowed to vanish from memory.
It's not only anger. You know, you have the disgust. I'm an offspring of these people. I have their blood. I must do something for them because I know the truth. So long as you have learned about truth, you just can't, turn yourself away from it. You must do something for these people. And also because the Japanese government keeps denying about the war atrocities. These people are human beings. They died just like worms.
The truth of Unit 731 goes beyond nationality or patriotism. It strikes to the heart of the human experience of the 20th century, and more of the truth will be told.
We must have justice for the victims. For the victims' dignity and the rights as human beings. And we must have justice to punish the war criminals.
We at least want them to acknowledge what happened in history, publicly apologize to us Chinese people, and give monetary compensation to the victims. That would be a wise move on the part of the Japanese government. Yet, Even if they did this, they would still be far from having compensated us for our losses.
I'm glad to be away from Unit 731. I was so stupid then. Being sent to a war crimes detention center helped me feel human again.
It is not enough to merely condemn Japan. America too must face the past.
The United States has to overcome the embarrassment, and it will be embarrassing, to reveal its role in letting these people go. The slogan of the Holocaust in Europe is never again. And I think that should be the slogan of the biological weaponry race between Japan, the United States, the former Soviet Union, and other countries. Never again. The world has suffered enough in the 20th century. Let the 21st century be a better place to live.